The moment I hit the kitchen floor, everything went black. When I came to, sprawled across the cold tiles with my head throbbing and my vision blurry, the first thing I heard wasn't concern or panic. It was my daughter-in-law Bethany's voice, calm and dismissive, floating down from upstairs. Just let her sleep it off. She's probably just being dramatic again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I lay there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, staring at the underside of my own kitchen counter, processing those words. Let her sleep it off. Dramatic. This from the woman I'd welcomed into my family, whose wedding I'd helped plan, whose children I babysat every weekend. The woman who was supposed to care about my well-being had just dismissed my medical emergency as attention-seeking behavior. What Bethany didn't know was that this fainting spell was just the beginning. What she really didn't know was that the mother-in-law she'd written off as overdramatic was about to uncover secrets that would destroy the perfect life she'd built on lies and manipulation. The morning it all started, I was Margaret Caldwell, 58 years old, living in the small coastal town of Millfield Harbor, Maine. I'd called this place home for 32 years, ever since I married my late husband Robert and moved here from Boston. Our house sat on Maple Avenue, a tree-lined street where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone was sick and where everyone knew each other's business, sometimes whether you wanted them to or not. Robert had passed away 18 months earlier, after a brief but aggressive battle with pancreatic cancer. The grief had been overwhelming, the kind that makes you forget to eat for days and find yourself crying in grocery store aisles. But I'd been slowly rebuilding my life, finding new routines and rediscovering who Margaret Caldwell was without Robert by her side. I'd started volunteering at the local animal shelter, joined a book club, and even taken up watercolor painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for during my busy years as a high school English teacher. My son Daniel was my anchor during those difficult months. At 31, he was everything a mother could hope for in a child: kind, successful, and genuinely caring. He worked as a software engineer for a tech company in Portland, about an hour's drive from Millfield Harbor, but he made the trip to see me at least twice a week. Daniel had inherited his father's gentle nature and his grandmother's sharp intellect, and watching him navigate his own grief while supporting me through mine had made me incredibly proud of the man he'd become. Then there was Bethany. Daniel had met her 3 years ago at a conference in Boston, and their whirlwind romance had led to marriage within 18 months. Bethany Chen was undeniably beautiful, with long black hair that always looked professionally styled and a wardrobe that suggested either excellent taste or significant disposable income. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company, a job that required frequent travel and seemed to pay very well based on the designer handbags and expensive jewelry she favored. From the beginning, my relationship with Bethany had been complicated. She was polite enough in person, never openly rude or confrontational, but there was something calculating in her interactions with our family. She had a way of making observations that sounded caring but felt pointed, like when she'd comment on how brave I was to live alone in such a big house, or how she admired my vintage furniture that Robert and I had carefully selected over decades of marriage. The twins, Emma and Ethan, were 5 years old and the absolute light of my life. They had Daniel's kind eyes and Bethany's striking features, and they were bright, curious children who filled every room with energy and laughter. I'd been babysitting them every Saturday for the past year, a tradition that started when Bethany began working weekend events for her company. Those Saturdays had become sacred to me, precious time with my grandchildren that helped fill the silence Robert's absence had left in my life. The house on Maple Avenue where I'd raised Daniel felt too big most days, but I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Every room held memories: the kitchen where Robert and I had shared morning coffee for 27 years, the living room where we'd watched Daniel take his first steps, the garden where Robert had taught me to grow tomatoes and roses. Bethany had made several comments about how impractical it was for me to maintain such a large property alone, usually followed by suggestions about lovely senior living communities or smaller condominiums that would be so much easier to manage. I'd always politely deflected these suggestions, explaining that I wasn't ready to leave the home I'd shared with Robert. What I didn't tell her was that I'd noticed the way her eyes lingered on our antique furniture, how she'd mentioned the potential of our neighborhood during recent real estate conversations, or how she'd casually asked about the details of Robert's life insurance policy during what was supposed to be a casual family dinner. The morning of the fainting incident started like any other Saturday. Emma and Ethan were spending the day with me while Daniel and Bethany attended some work-related function in Portland. I'd planned a full day of activities: pancakes for breakfast, a trip to the harbor to feed the seagulls, maybe some finger painting in the afternoon. The children had arrived full of excitement, chattering about a new movie they wanted to see and a fort they were planning to build in my backyard. I'd been feeling slightly off all week, nothing dramatic, just a persistent fatigue that I'd attributed to the change in seasons. October in Maine could be unpredictable, and I thought maybe I was fighting off a minor cold. There had been some dizziness when I stood up too quickly, occasional moments where I felt lightheaded or slightly nauseous, but nothing that seemed serious enough to worry about. At 58, I'd learned to expect some minor aches and pains, and I'd been dealing with my share of stress since Robert's death. The twins and I had finished breakfast and were cleaning up the kitchen when it happened. I was loading the dishwasher, listening to Emma tell me about her art project at school, when suddenly the room started spinning. The voices around me became distant and muffled, like I was hearing them through water. I remember reaching for the counter to steady myself, feeling my legs buckle beneath me, and then nothing. When consciousness returned, I was lying on the cold ceramic tiles of my kitchen floor, staring up at the ceiling fixture that Robert and I had installed during our kitchen renovation 5 years earlier. My head was pounding, and there was a sharp pain in my left shoulder where I'd apparently hit the ground. The twins were standing over me, their faces pale with worry, Emma holding my hand and Ethan asking if I was okay in a small, frightened voice. That's when I heard Bethany's voice from upstairs. Daniel and Bethany had apparently returned early from their event, and the children must have called for them when I collapsed. But instead of rushing downstairs to check on me, instead of calling for medical assistance or showing any concern for my well-being, Bethany's response was to dismiss my condition as attention-seeking behavior. "Just let her sleep it off," she'd said, her tone carrying the same casual dismissal she might use to discuss a child's tantrum. "She's probably just being dramatic again." Daniel's voice followed, concerned and confused. "Mom fainted, Bethany. We should check on her. Maybe call a doctor." "She's fine," Bethany replied, and I could hear her moving around upstairs, presumably getting ready for whatever they had planned next. "Trust me, I know the type. She's just looking for attention since Robert died. It's actually pretty common in older women who feel neglected." The clinical way she analyzed my supposed psychological condition was almost as shocking as her complete lack of concern for my physical well-being. She spoke about me like I was a case study rather than a family member, like my potential medical emergency was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to her schedule. I managed to sit up slowly, accepting Emma's help and reassuring both children that I was okay, even though I felt anything but okay. My head was still spinning, and the shoulder pain was getting worse, but what hurt most was the realization that the woman my son had married viewed me as nothing more than a burden and a nuisance. Daniel eventually came downstairs, his face creased with worry as he knelt beside me and asked how I was feeling. He wanted to drive me to the emergency room, insisting that fainting wasn't something to ignore, especially at my age. But Bethany appeared in the kitchen doorway, perfectly put together as always, and immediately began minimizing the situation. "She's obviously fine now," Bethany said, checking her phone rather than looking at me. "People faint all the time. It's probably just dehydration or low blood sugar. No need to make a federal case out of it." She suggested that I'd been pushing myself too hard, taking on too much responsibility with the children, perhaps trying to prove something to myself or others. Her analysis was delivered with the kind of concerned tone that sounded caring to anyone who wasn't listening carefully, but I could hear the subtle implications underneath. I was getting older, less capable, maybe not the reliable caretaker I used to be. "Maybe it would be better if we found other arrangements for the kids on Saturdays," Bethany continued, her suggestion presented as concern for my well-being, rather than a desire to limit my access to my grandchildren. "You shouldn't feel obligated to take on so much responsibility during this difficult time in your life." Daniel looked torn between his concern for me and his desire to support his wife's judgment. He'd always been a peacekeeper, someone who tried to find middle ground in family conflicts, and I could see him struggling to balance his instinct to care for his mother with his loyalty to his marriage. "I'm fine," I insisted, though standing up made me dizzy again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. It was just a momentary thing. Maybe I did get a little dehydrated while chasing these two around the backyard yesterday. Bethany smiled, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. See? She's already making excuses and minimizing. Classic attention-seeking behavior followed by denial when the attention becomes uncomfortable. The casual cruelty of her psychological assessment was breathtaking. She was diagnosing me with attention-seeking behavior while simultaneously denying me the attention and care that any family member should receive during a medical episode. It was a perfect example of the double-bind situations she often created, where my legitimate needs were reframed as character flaws. The rest of that Saturday passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Daniel stayed for another hour, clearly reluctant to leave me alone, but Bethany had plans that couldn't be changed and a social commitment that required his presence. The twins seemed subdued after witnessing my collapse, and I spent the afternoon reassuring them that I was perfectly fine while privately wondering if that was true. That evening, alone in the house that suddenly felt more empty than usual, I found myself replaying Bethany's words over and over. Just let her sleep it off. The casual dismissal stung more than I wanted to admit, but it also awakened something in me that had been dormant since Robert's death. It was a familiar feeling from my teaching days, the instinct that told me when a student was lying or when there was more to a situation than appeared on the surface. I'd spent 30 years teaching high school English, and in that time, I'd developed a keen ability to read people, to notice the disconnect between what they said and what they meant. Bethany's reaction to my fainting spell wasn't just callous, it was revealing. Her immediate assumption that I was being dramatic, her clinical analysis of my supposed psychological condition, her quick pivot to questioning my ability to care for the children, it all felt too prepared, too convenient. Over the following days, I began paying closer attention to Bethany's behavior, not out of suspicion initially but out of a growing awareness that I'd been giving her the benefit of the doubt for too long. I started noticing patterns that I'd previously dismissed as personality quirks or cultural differences. There was the way she always had an excuse for why she couldn't attend family gatherings at my house, but never hesitated to invite Daniel's family to events at locations she chose. There was her habit of making comments about my health, my age, my living situation that sounded concerned but always seemed to emphasize my limitations rather than offering genuine support. Most telling was her relationship with the twin. When other people were around, Bethany was an attentive, engaged mother who spoke lovingly about her children and their activities, but I'd begun to notice that when she thought no one was paying attention, her interaction with Emma and Ethan was more distant, more transactional. She managed their schedules and activities with the efficiency of a personal assistant, rather than the warmth of a mother. The children themselves seemed to sense this difference. They were always excited to spend time with me, but their enthusiasm for going home after our Saturdays together was notably less pronounced. Emma had started asking if she could call me during the week, and Ethan had begun hiding small toys at my house so he'd have something to look forward to on our next visit. A week after the fainting incident, I had lunch with my longtime friend Patricia Moreau, someone I'd known since Daniel was in elementary school. Patricia had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring, and she'd always been my go-to person for medical questions or health concerns. When I mentioned my fainting spell, her response was immediate and concerned. "Margaret, fainting at your age isn't something to ignore," she said, setting down her coffee cup with enough force to make me pay attention. "Especially if you've been feeling tired and dizzy. Have you seen a doctor?" I explained Bethany's assessment, that it was probably just dehydration or attention-seeking behavior, and Patricia's expression grew increasingly troubled as I described my daughter-in-law's reaction to my medical episode. "That's not medical advice, that's manipulation," Patricia said bluntly. "And the fact that she immediately jumped to questioning your mental state rather than your physical health is concerning. A loving family member's first instinct should be to make sure you're okay, not to analyze your psychological motivation." Patricia insisted on taking my blood pressure right there in the restaurant, producing a portable monitor from her purse with the efficiency of someone who'd never really retired from nursing. The readings were elevated, not dangerously so, but enough to warrant medical attention, and certainly enough to explain why I might be experiencing dizziness and fatigue. "You need to see your doctor," Patricia said firmly. and you need to stop letting anyone, family or otherwise, convince you that legitimate health concerns are psychological problems. That afternoon, I called Dr. Williams' office and made an appointment for the following week. I also did something I hadn't done in months. I started keeping a journal, writing down my observations about family interactions, my own health symptoms, and the growing list of questions that Bethany's behavior had raised in my mind. The journal started as a way to track my symptoms for Dr. Williams, but it quickly became something more. As I wrote about the fainting incident and Bethany's reaction, I found myself remembering other moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt part of a larger pattern. There was the time Bethany had suggested I might be developing early dementia because I'd misplaced my car keys, a comment she'd made in front of Daniel with the kind of concerned tone that made it impossible to object without seeming defensive. There was her habit of correcting my stories about family events, always with small details that made me seem confused or unreliable. Most disturbing was a conversation I'd overheard between Bethany and Daniel, about 6 months earlier. I'd arrived early to pick up the twins, and had heard voices from the kitchen window as I approached the front door. Bethany was expressing concern about my declining mental state, and suggesting that Daniel might need to consider difficult decisions about my living situation, sooner rather than later. At the time I'd assumed she was genuinely worried about my well-being following Robert's death. Grief could indeed affect memory and judgment, and I'd experienced my share of both during those difficult months, but now remembering the clinical detachment in her voice, I wondered if her concerns were less about my well-being, and more about her convenience. The appointment with Dr. Williams revealed what Patricia had suspected. My blood pressure was elevated, and I was showing signs of significant stress that could easily account for dizziness, fatigue, and fainting spells. He prescribed medication to help manage the blood pressure, and recommended some lifestyle changes to reduce stress, but he also validated what I'd been feeling. These were real physical symptoms, with real medical causes, not psychological manifestations of attention-seeking behavior. Has anyone been suggesting that your symptoms might be psychological rather than physical? Dr. Williams asked, a question that seemed oddly specific until I realized that Patricia had probably called him before my appointment. When I explained Bethany's analysis of my condition, Dr. Williams's expression grew serious. Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to understand something important. Family members who consistently dismiss legitimate health concerns or suggest that physical symptoms are psychological manipulation are often projecting their own issues onto the situation. It's a form of gaslighting that can be very harmful to your actual health. Gaslighting. The term hit me like a physical blow because it named something I'd been experiencing but hadn't been able to identify. Bethany wasn't just being callous or unsympathetic. She was systematically undermining my confidence in my own perceptions and experiences. That evening, I sat in Robert's old study, surrounded by the books he'd collected over a lifetime of reading, and tried to make sense of what I'd learned. My physical symptoms were real and treatable. My emotional responses to family situations were reasonable and valid, and my growing suspicion that something was fundamentally wrong with my relationship with Bethany was not the product of grief-induced paranoia. I decided to pay closer attention to the dynamics in my own family, to trust my instincts about what I was observing, and to stop giving Bethany the benefit of the doubt, simply because she was married to my son. If she was indeed manipulating family situations for her own benefit, I owed it to Daniel and the twins to understand exactly what was happening. The following Saturday, when Bethany dropped off the children for their usual visit, I watched the interaction more carefully than I had in months. Her goodbye to Emma and Ethan was perfunctory, more focused on the schedule for pickup than on any emotional connection with her children. She handed me a typed list of instructions that seemed excessive for a 5-hour visit with children I'd been caring for regularly for over a year. Emma needs to rest for at least an hour this afternoon, the list specified. Ethan can't have any sugar after 2 p.m. Please don't let them get too dirty or too excited. I don't want them overstimulated when I pick them up. The instructions were presented as concern for the children's well-being, but they had the practical effect of limiting the kind of activities that made our Saturdays special. No baking cookies together, no messy art projects, no energetic games in the backyard. It was as if Bethany was systematically removing the joy from my time with my grandchildren, while making it seem like she was being a responsible parent. More telling was her comment as she prepared to leave. "I hope you're feeling better this week, Margaret. We can't have any more dramatic episodes that upset the children." The way she phrased it made my fainting spell sound like a choice I'd made rather than a medical event I'd experienced. She was rewriting history, turning my health crisis into evidence of my instability, and she was doing it in a way that made me seem unreasonable if I objected. That afternoon, while the twins napped, a rest period I instituted to comply with Bethany's instructions, I found myself thinking about patterns of behavior that extended beyond just health-related incidents. There was Bethany's insistence on hosting family holidays at her house rather than continuing the tradition of gathering at my home. There was her subtle but persistent criticism of my parenting style when I interacted with the twins. There was her habit of scheduling activities for Daniel that conflicted with our regular family dinner. Each individual incident could be explained away as coincidence or misunderstanding, but together they formed a picture of someone systematically working to minimize my role in my own family's life. The realization was both heartbreaking and infuriating, but it also activated the same protective instincts that had made me a fierce advocate for my students during my teaching career. I'd spent 30 years protecting young people from adults who didn't have their best interests at heart, and I'd developed a keen ability to recognize manipulation, even when it was subtle or well disguised. The skills that had made me successful as an educator were suddenly relevant to my own family situation, and I realized that I'd been so focused on grieving Robert's loss that I'd stopped paying attention to the dynamics that were developing around me. When Bethany returned to pick up the children that evening, she immediately began questioning them about their day in a way that felt more like an interrogation than parental interest. Had they been good for Grandma? Had I made them follow the rules? Had anything unusual happened? Emma and Ethan answered dutifully, but I could see the confusion in their faces. They were being asked to evaluate their own behavior and my care in a way that seemed to undermine the natural trust between grandparent and grandchild. It was as if Bethany was training them to view me as someone who needed to be monitored and reported on, rather than simply loved and enjoyed. After they left, I sat in my living room and made a decision that felt both scary and liberating. I was going to start paying attention to everything, every comment, every suggestion, every casual observation that Bethany made about my health, my capabilities, or my role in the family. I was going to trust my instincts about what I observed, and I was going to stop giving her the benefit of the doubt. More importantly, I was going to start asking questions, not confrontational questions that would put her on the defensive, but the kind of careful observational questions that had served me well as a teacher when I suspected a student was not being truthful about their home situation or academic performance. That night, I opened a new section in my journal and began documenting everything I could remember about Bethany's behavior patterns over the past few years. What I discovered was disturbing in its consistency. From the very beginning of her relationship with Daniel, she had been working to position herself as the primary influence in his life, while systematically undermining other relationships that might compete for his attention or loyalty. She'd been subtle about it, never openly confrontational or obviously manipulative, but always strategic in her approach. She'd isolated Daniel from several of his longtime friends by creating scheduling conflicts or expressing concern about their influence on him. She'd gradually reduced the frequency of family gatherings by always having compelling reasons why alternative plans were more practical or convenient. Most concerning was the pattern I was beginning to see in her interaction with me specifically. Ever since Robert's death, Bethany had been positioning herself as the expert on my psychological and physical well-being, offering analysis and recommendations that consistently emphasized my limitations and growing dependency. She'd been creating a narrative where I was becoming less capable and more needy, a narrative that would justify significant changes to my living situation and my role in the family. I needed to understand what happened when I wasn't there to witness interactions, and I needed to see how Bethany behaved when she thought her manipulation was working. The first revelation came during a phone conversation with Daniel, about 2 weeks after I'd started implementing my new approach. He called on a Thursday evening, something that had become less frequent since his marriage, but which I'd always treasured as our private time to catch up without Bethany's presence. "Mom, "I wanted to check on you," he said, and I could hear genuine concern in his voice. "Bethany mentioned that you've seemed more tired lately, and she's worried that you might be pushing yourself too hard trying to maintain your normal routine." It was fascinating how Bethany had reframed my strategic withdrawal as evidence of declining health rather than as a reasonable response to stress. She was using my own tactics against me, turning my decision to create boundaries into proof that I needed more supervision and intervention. "I have been taking things a bit easier," I admitted, which was technically true. Dr. Williams suggested that managing stress was important for my blood pressure, so I'm trying to be more selective about my commitments. "That's good," Daniel said, though I could hear uncertainty in his voice. "But Bethany thinks maybe we should consider some additional support for you. You know, someone to help with house cleaning or grocery shopping. Maybe even a companion service for the days when you're feeling isolated." The suggestion was presented as caring concern, but I recognized it as the next step in a carefully planned campaign to establish my dependency and incompetence. Once outside caregivers were involved in my daily life, it would be much easier to document my supposed need for more comprehensive assistance. "That's very thoughtful," I said carefully, "but I'm managing fine on my own. The house isn't that much work, and I actually enjoy my grocery shopping trips and other errands. They give me a sense of purpose and independence." There was a pause, and when Daniel spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Are you having any problems with memory or confusion? Bethany mentioned that you seemed disoriented the day you fainted, and she's concerned that there might be some cognitive issues we need to address." The question hit me like a physical blow, not because I was concerned about my mental state, but because it revealed how systematically Bethany had been building a case against my competence. She was now suggesting to my own son that I might be experiencing early dementia, based on nothing more than a moment of disorientation following a fainting spell caused by high blood pressure. "Daniel," I said, working to keep my voice steady. I was unconscious for several minutes after hitting my head on the kitchen floor. Anyone would be disoriented after an experience like that. Dr. Williams examined me thoroughly, and there are no signs of cognitive decline. My blood pressure medication has made a significant difference in how I'm feeling. "Of course," Daniel said quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest there was anything seriously wrong. It's just that Bethany has some experience with these issues through her work, and she wanted to make sure we weren't missing any warning signs." This was news to me. As far as I knew, Bethany worked in pharmaceutical marketing, not in any field that would give her expertise in geriatric care or cognitive assessment. But it was another example of how she positioned herself as an authority on subjects where she had no actual qualification. After we hung up, I found myself both angry and impressed by the sophistication of Bethany's strategy. She wasn't just undermining my credibility in obvious ways, she was creating a comprehensive narrative about my declining capabilities that would justify increasingly invasive interventions in my life. More concerning, she was doing it in a way that made Daniel feel like a caring son who was looking out for his mother's best interests. I decided it was time to do some research of my own. The next morning, I drove to the Millfield Harbor Public Library and spent several hours learning about elder abuse, psychological manipulation, and the warning signs of financial exploitation. What I discovered was both enlightening and terrifying. Bethany's behavior matched several patterns described in articles about psychological abuse of elderly family members. The consistent undermining of my credibility, the suggestions that my perceptions were unreliable, the attempts to isolate me from independent medical advice, all of these were recognized tactics used by people who wanted to gain control over an older person's life and resources. Most disturbing was an article about financial exploitation that described how abusers often spent months or years building a case for their victims' incompetence before making any direct moves against their assets. The goal was to create such a comprehensive record of declining capability that legal guardianship or conservatorship could be obtained with minimal resistance from courts or other family members. I thought about my house on Maple Avenue, the life insurance settlement from Robert's death, and the retirement accounts we'd carefully built over decades of work and saving. I thought about the way Bethany had casually mentioned the potential of my neighborhood during real estate conversations, and how she'd asked seemingly innocent questions about my financial planning and estate arrangements. For the first time since this all began, I felt genuinely frightened, not of Bethany herself, but of how vulnerable I might be to the kind of systematic manipulation she seemed to be orchestrating. If she could convince Daniel that I was experiencing cognitive decline, if she could establish a pattern of documented incompetence, she might be able to gain significant control over my life and assets. I needed help, but I also needed to be smart about how I sought it. Going to Daniel directly would likely backfire, given how effectively Bethany had been managing his perceptions. Involving other family members seemed risky since I didn't know how far her influence extended. What I needed was professional advice from someone who understood these dynamics and could help me protect myself without creating more family conflict. The answer came from an unexpected source. While I was researching elder abuse at the library, I struck up a conversation with Linda Morrison, a woman about my age who was researching similar topics. It turned out that Linda was a retired social worker who had specialized in elder abuse cases during her career. When I explained my situation in general terms, her response was immediate and alarming. "What you're describing sounds like the early stages of a very sophisticated exploitation scheme," Linda said, her voice low enough that other library patrons couldn't overhear. "The psychological undermining, the medical gaslighting, the isolation from support systems, these are all classic patterns, and the fact that it's coming from a family member makes it much more dangerous because they have easier access to your resources and your support network." Linda offered to meet with me privately to discuss my situation in more detail, and we arranged to have coffee the following day at a small cafe in the next town over. I was being paranoid about meeting locations, but something about Bethany's level of planning made me cautious about being seen discussing these topics with anyone who might be able to help me. The conversation with Linda was both validating and sobering. She confirmed that Bethany's behavior showed multiple red flags for psychological manipulation and potential financial exploitation. More importantly, she helped me understand that my instincts about the systematic nature of this campaign were correct. "Abusers like this don't act impulsively," Linda explained. "They plan carefully, building their case over time so that when they make their move, everyone around the victim has already been convinced that intervention is necessary. The beauty of it from their perspective is that the victim often ends up looking paranoid or delusional when they try to resist." Linda recommended that I document everything going forward, but she also warned me that documentation alone might not be enough. "Courts see this kind of family conflict all the time," she said, "and they tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to elderly people who seem to be having disputes with their caregiver. If she's building a case that you're becoming incompetent, you need to build an equally strong case that you're being manipulated." She gave me the contact information for a lawyer who specialized in elder law and abuse cases, someone who could help me understand my legal vulnerabilities and protect my assets if necessary. She also suggested that I consider hiring a private investigator to document Bethany's background and current activities. "People who do this kind of systematic manipulation often have a history," Linda explained. "If she's done this before, there might be a paper trail. And if she's currently engaged in activities that contradict her stated concerns about your welfare, that could be very useful evidence." The suggestion of hiring a private investigator felt extreme, like something from a television drama rather than real life. But as I drove home from our meeting, I found myself thinking about all the things I didn't know about Bethany's background, her work, her financial situation, and her past relationship. For someone who'd been married to my son for 3 years, she remained remarkably opaque about her personal history. I'd always attributed this to cultural differences, or simple privacy preferences, but now I wondered if there were more deliberate reasons for her reluctance to share details about her past. When Daniel had first brought her home, she'd mentioned growing up in California and attending college there, but she'd been vague about specifics. Her work history seemed similarly unclear, with references to various marketing positions, but no clear career trajectory. Most concerning was the realization that I'd never met any of Bethany's family or longtime friends. She'd explained this by saying her parents were deceased, and she'd lost touch with college friends due to frequent moves for work, but now that explanation seemed suspiciously convenient. It was as if she'd appeared in Daniel's life, fully formed, with no verifiable history or connections that predated their relationship. That evening, I called the elder law attorney Linda had recommended and scheduled a consultation for the following week. I also spent time researching private investigators in the Portland area, looking for someone with experience in background investigations and elder abuse cases. The attorney consultation was eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected. Sarah Wellington was a sharp, practical woman in her 50s who specialized in protecting elderly clients from various forms of exploitation. When I described Bethany's behavior patterns and the concerns Linda had raised, her response was immediate and professional. "You're right to be concerned," Sarah said, reviewing the notes I'd brought about documented incidents and conversations. "What you're describing fits a pattern we see regularly in financial exploitation cases. The medical gaslighting, the isolation from support systems, the systematic undermining of your credibility, these are all recognized tactics." Sarah explained that while I wasn't in immediate danger of losing my autonomy or assets, the foundation was being laid for more serious interventions down the road. If your daughter-in-law can establish a pattern of documented incompetence, she might be able to petition for guardianship or conservatorship, especially if she can get your son's support for such a move. The legal implications were sobering. Once someone gained legal guardianship over me, they would have control over my medical decisions, living arrangements, and financial assets. Even if the guardianship was eventually overturned, the process could take years and cost enormous amounts of money in legal fees. "The good news," Sarah continued, "is that you're recognizing this pattern early, and you're taking steps to protect yourself. The documentation you've started is excellent, and the fact that you're seeking professional advice shows that your judgment and decision-making abilities are intact." Sarah recommended several immediate steps. First, I should have a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation to establish my current cognitive status officially. This would create a baseline that would be difficult to dispute later if questions arose about my competence. Second, I should consider updating my estate planning documents to include specific protections against undue influence and exploitation. This might include naming an independent third party as a backup decision maker, or creating trusts that would be difficult for anyone to manipulate. Third, I should be very careful about any documents Bethany might ask me to sign, any financial transactions she might suggest, or any changes to my living situation that she might recommend. People engaged in exploitation often try to get their victims to make changes that seem reasonable at the time, but actually increase their vulnerability, Sarah warned. Finally, she agreed that hiring a private investigator to research Bethany's background was a wise precaution. If she's done this before, there might be evidence of it, and if her current situation is different from what she's told your family, that could be very relevant to understanding her motivations. I left Sarah's office feeling both more informed and more concerned than when I'd arrived. The professional validation of my suspicions was reassuring, but the legal vulnerabilities she'd outlined were frightening. I was potentially one medical emergency or family crisis away from losing control over my own life. The private investigator I ultimately hired was a woman named Carol Zhang, a former police detective who now specialized in background investigations and domestic situations. Carol was professional, discreet, and experienced in exactly the kind of research I need. "I'll start with basic background verification," Carol explained during our initial meeting. "Educational history, employment history, previous addresses and financial records that are publicly available. I'll also look for any legal issues, previous marriages or relationships, and social media presence that might give us insight into her current activities." Carol warned me that the investigation might take several weeks and could potentially uncover information that would be difficult to process. "Sometimes people aren't who they claim to be," she said, "and sometimes they have histories that explain their current behavior in ways that are hard to accept." While Carol worked on the background investigation, I focused on implementing the other recommendations Sarah had made. I scheduled comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations with independent providers, who had no connection to my family situation. I met with an estate planning attorney to update my documents with additional protections against undue influence. Most importantly, I continued my careful documentation of family interactions, paying particular attention to any attempts by Bethany to influence decisions about my health, living situation, or finances. What I discovered was both subtle and systematic. Bethany had begun making casual comments about the burden my house maintenance placed on Daniel, suggesting that he worried constantly about my ability to manage the property safely. She'd started questioning my driving abilities, mentioning incidents where I'd supposedly seemed confused about directions or uncertain about parking. Most concerning were her attempts to insert herself into my medical care. She'd suggested that she should accompany me to doctor's appointments to help me remember what was discussed. She'd offered to help me organize my medications to make sure I wasn't missing doses or taking incorrect amounts. Each suggestion was presented as helpful concern, but the cumulative effect was to establish her as an essential intermediary between me and my own health care. If I accepted these offers of help, I would be creating documentation that I needed assistance with basic life management, exactly the kind of evidence that could be used later to support claims about my incompetence. The medical and psychological evaluations I'd arranged came back with results that were both reassuring and strategically valuable. My cognitive function was well within normal ranges for my age, my mental health was stable despite the stress of recent family conflicts, and my physical health issues were completely manageable with proper medical care. Dr. Susan Rodriguez, the geriatrician who conducted my comprehensive evaluation, was particularly helpful in documenting my current status. Ms. Caldwell, based on my examination and testing, you show no signs of cognitive decline or impairment, she said, providing me with written documentation of her findings. Your memory, judgment, and decision-making abilities are all intact. The stress you've been experiencing appears to be situational rather than indicative of any underlying mental health condition. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Michael Foster reached similar conclusions. You're dealing with a significant amount of family stress, he noted, but your responses to these challenges show good insight, appropriate emotional regulation, and sound judgment. There's no evidence of depression, anxiety, or any other condition that would impair your ability to make independent decisions about your life. Having professional documentation of my mental and physical competence felt like putting on armor. Whatever Bethany was planning, she would now have to overcome official medical opinions that contradicted any claims about my declining capabilities. Carol's background investigation, meanwhile, was beginning to yield disturbing results. The preliminary report she provided, after 3 weeks of research, raised serious questions about almost every aspect of Bethany's claimed history. The educational credentials she's mentioned don't check out, Carol reported during our meeting at a discreet coffee shop outside of town. There's no record of her attending the university she claims, and the degrees she supposedly earned don't exist in their alumni database. More concerning was Bethany's employment history. The pharmaceutical company she claims to work for has no record of employing anyone by her name, Carol continued. I was able to verify that she receives regular payments from a marketing consulting firm, but when I contacted them, they said she works exclusively with elder care facilities and assisted living communities. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Bethany wasn't working in pharmaceutical marketing as she'd claimed. She was working specifically with organizations that dealt with elderly people, exactly the kind of position that would give her access to information about financial exploitation and legal guardianship procedures. There's more, Carol said, sliding a folder across the table. I found records of 2 previous marriages, both to men significantly older than herself. In both cases, the marriages ended within 3 years, and in both cases the ex-husbands died within 2 years of the divorce. The folder contained death certificates, divorce records, and newspaper obituaries that painted a chilling picture. Bethany's first husband had been a retired engineer in his 60s, who'd died of complications from a fall. Her second husband had been a widowed businessman in his 70s, who'd died of heart failure. Both men had been financially comfortable at the time of their marriages, and both had experienced significant health declines during their relationships with Bethany. I can't prove anything definitively, Carol cautioned, but the pattern is concerning. Both ex-husbands had their wills changed during their marriages, to include Bethany as a beneficiary, and both died before those provisions could be revised during divorce proceedings. I sat in that coffee shop staring at documents that suggested my daughter-in-law might be a serial predator who targeted older men for financial gain. The woman who'd dismissed my fainting spell as attention-seeking behavior, who'd been systematically undermining my credibility and independence, might have done this before to other families, other victims. What about Daniel? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Is he in danger? Carol's expression was grim. Based on the pattern, I'd say your son was targeted specifically because of his connection to you. You're the primary asset in this situation: the house, the life insurance settlement, the retirement account. Daniel is probably the means to access those resources, not the target himself. The realization was both heartbreaking and terrifying. My son, who I'd raised to be trusting and kind, had been manipulated into a relationship with someone who saw him as nothing more than a pathway to my ass. The twins, my precious grandchildren, were being raised by a woman who might be capable of murder. What happens now? I asked Carol. Now we gather more evidence, she said. What I've found so far is suspicious, but it's not necessarily criminal. We need to understand her current activities, her financial situation, and her specific plans regarding your family, and we need to do it carefully, because if she realizes she's being investigated, she might accelerate her timeline. The drive home from that meeting was one of the longest of my life. I felt like I was seeing my family's situation clearly for the first time in years, and what I saw was terrifying, but I also felt something else: determination. The retired English teacher who'd spent 30 years protecting students from predatory adults was not going to let anyone destroy her family without a fight. That evening, I sat in Robert's study and began planning my counterattack. Bethany had underestimated me completely, assuming that a grieving widow would be an easy target for manipulation and exploitation. She was about to discover that the woman she'd dismissed as incompetent had access to resources, skills, and allies she'd never imagined. The game was about to change again, and this time I would be the one setting the rules. The plan I developed over the following weeks was both simple and sophisticated. Instead of confronting Bethany directly or trying to convince Daniel of her true nature, I was going to give her exactly what she seemed to want while simultaneously gathering the evidence needed to expose her completely. Carol had discovered that Bethany was currently working on what appeared to be her largest financial target yet. Through her consulting work with elder care facilities, she'd gained access to detailed information about wealthy elderly clients and their family situation. More disturbing, she'd been systematically cultivating relationships with family members of these potential targets, positioning herself as a trusted advisor on elder care issues. She's not just targeting your family, Carol explained during our weekly update meeting. She's running what appears to be a sophisticated operation targeting multiple elderly individuals across the region. Your situation is just one of several she's working on simultaneously. This revelation changed everything. Bethany wasn't just a manipulative daughter-in-law trying to exploit one family. She was a career criminal operating an organized elder abuse scheme. The stakes were much higher than I'd initially realized, and the potential impact extended far beyond my own family. Carol had also uncovered evidence of Bethany's current financial activities that painted a disturbing picture of her motivations and methods. She was living well beyond any legitimate income from her consulting work, supporting an expensive lifestyle through what appeared to be systematic theft from elderly victims. She's got accounts in 3 different states, Carol reported, and financial transactions that suggest she's been receiving regular payments from sources that don't match her claimed employment. I think she's been successfully exploiting other families for years. The most chilling discovery was evidence that Bethany had been researching the legal procedures for obtaining emergency guardianship in Maine. She'd downloaded forms, contacted lawyers who specialized in elder law, and even visited the courthouse to inquire about filing procedure. Emergency guardianship can be obtained very quickly if there's evidence of immediate danger to an elderly person's welfare, Carol explained. If she could create a situation where you appeared to be in crisis,
she might be able to gain legal control over your decisions and assets within a matter of days. This information crystallized my strategy. Instead of waiting for Bethany to make her move, I was going to force her hand by creating the very situation she seemed to be planning. But I would be controlling the circumstances, gathering evidence of her true intentions, and ensuring that when she revealed her real nature, there would be witnesses and documentation to prove what she was really doing. The first phase involved gradually increasing my apparent vulnerability and dependency. Over the course of several weeks, I began mentioning minor health concerns to Daniel, expressing worry about managing various aspects of my daily life, and subtly suggesting that I might need more support than I'd previously been willing to accept. I was careful to make these changes seem natural and gradual, the kind of decline that might genuinely concern a loving family member but which would also present opportunities for someone with exploitative intention. I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by financial paperwork, expressed confusion about some of the forms my insurance company had sent, and admitted that I'd been having trouble keeping track of medication schedules. Bethany's response was immediate and revealing. Instead of offering emotional support or suggesting simple solutions to these manageable problems, she immediately began positioning herself as the person who should take charge of addressing my difficulty. She volunteered to help me organize my financial documents, suggesting that it would be easier if she had access to my accounts, so she could monitor them for any irregularity. She offered to speak with my doctors directly about my medication concerns, proposing that she could serve as my medical advocate to ensure I was getting appropriate care. Most telling was her suggestion that I might benefit from having someone with legal authority to help me make important decisions. "It's just a precaution," she explained to Daniel during a family dinner I deliberately orchestrated. "If your mother has a medical emergency or becomes temporarily unable to make decisions for herself, it would be helpful to have someone already authorized to act on her behalf."
Daniel was reluctant to discuss such arrangements, clearly uncomfortable with the implication that I might become incapacitated. But Bethany pressed the issue, using exactly the kind of medical and psychological concerns she'd been building for months. "I'm worried about her judgment," Bethany said, speaking about me as if I weren't sitting at the same table. "She's been making some questionable decisions lately, and I'm concerned that she might not recognize when she needs help. Having legal safeguards in place would protect her from making choices she might regret later." I played my part perfectly, appearing confused by the legal terminology and grateful for Bethany's apparent concern. "I suppose it makes sense to plan ahead," I said, though I was actually recording the conversation on my phone with Carol's coaching. "I don't really understand all these legal things, and it would be nice to know someone could help me if I needed it." Bethany's eyes lit up with an expression I'd never seen before, a look of satisfaction and anticipation that confirmed everything Carol and I had suspected about her motivations. She wasn't offering to help me, she was maneuvering to gain control over my life and assets. Within days of that dinner conversation, Bethany had contacted a lawyer and scheduled an appointment to discuss guardianship arrangements. She told Daniel it was just an information gathering session, a way to understand our options before any crisis situation arose. But Carol's surveillance revealed that Bethany had been much more specific in her communications with the attorney. She'd described me as someone experiencing significant cognitive decline, provided examples of concerning behavior that were either fabricated or grossly exaggerated, and expressed urgent concern about my ability to make sound financial and medical decisions. She'd even suggested that I might be experiencing early-stage dementia, despite having no medical training or evidence to support such a diagnosis. The lawyer she'd chosen was someone who specialized in emergency guardianship cases, someone who was accustomed to moving quickly when families presented evidence of immediate danger to an elderly person's welfare. Bethany wasn't just planning to gain control over my decisions, she was planning to do it in a way that would be very difficult to reverse. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. With Carol's help, I'd spent weeks gathering evidence of Bethany's true background, her pattern of targeting elderly victims, and her current financial crimes. I'd obtained professional medical and psychological evaluations that documented my competence and mental clarity. I'd worked with Sarah Wellington to create legal protections that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to gain unauthorized control over my assets. Most importantly, I'd been carefully documenting every conversation, every suggestion and every attempt by Bethany to position herself as my caregiver and decision-maker. I had recordings, written records, and witness statements that clearly showed her systematic campaign to undermine my independence and credibility. Now it was time to spring the trap I'd been setting for weeks. The opportunity came when Bethany suggested that I might benefit from a trial period of increased support, a temporary arrangement where she would help manage some of my daily responsibilities to see how much assistance I actually need. She proposed taking over my bill paying, medication management, and communication with my healthcare providers for a month, just to ensure everything was being handled properly. It would give us all peace of mind, she told Daniel, and it would help your mother adjust gradually to accepting help instead of trying to manage everything independently. I agreed to the arrangement enthusiastically, expressing gratitude for her willingness to take on such responsibilities and relief that I wouldn't have to worry about making mistakes with important tasks. But what Bethany didn't know was that I'd already arranged for every aspect of this trial period to be monitored and documented. Carol had installed discreet surveillance equipment in my home that would record any unauthorized access to my personal documents or financial information. Sarah Wellington had created dummy accounts and documents that would appear legitimate to casual inspection, but which would immediately alert us if anyone attempted to access them without authorization. Most importantly, I'd arranged for Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Foster to conduct surprise wellness checks during the trial period. Official visits that would document my actual mental and physical state during the time when Bethany was claiming to provide essential care for my declining condition. The results were everything I'd hoped for, and more disturbing than I'd expected. Within days of gaining access to my financial information, Bethany had begun attempting to transfer money from my accounts to ones she controlled. She'd contacted my insurance company to inquire about changing beneficiaries on my policies. She'd even visited a real estate agent to discuss the potential sale value of my house. The surveillance footage Carol had installed captured Bethany going through my personal papers when she thought I was napping, photographing documents related to my estate planning and retirement account. She'd made copies of my social security card, birth certificate, and other identity documents that could be used to open accounts or make financial transactions in my name. Most damning was a recorded phone conversation where Bethany discussed her timeline with someone Carol hadn't yet identified. "The old woman is more compliant than I expected," Bethany said, speaking in a tone I'd never heard her use before. "I should be able to move to the next phase within a few weeks. Once I have legal authority, the asset transfer will be straightforward." She went on to describe her plans for my future in clinical, detached terms that made it clear she viewed me as nothing more than a source of income. She discussed the possibility of placing me in a low-cost care facility once she'd gained control of my assets, explaining that it would be easy to justify such a placement based on the documentation she'd been building about my declining mental state. "The son won't be a problem," she continued. "He's been completely convinced that his mother needs intervention. By the time this is all finalized, he'll be grateful that I was willing to take responsibility for her care." The conversation confirmed everything we'd suspected about Bethany's motivations and methods. But it also revealed something even more disturbing. This wasn't an impulsive crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned operation that she'd been executing for months, possibly years. Carol had also made progress in identifying Bethany's other current target. Through financial records and surveillance, she'd discovered that Bethany was simultaneously working on at least 3 other elderly victims, all of whom were in various stages of the same systematic exploitation I'd been experiencing. "We need to involve law enforcement," Carol said during our emergency meeting after discovering the extent of Bethany's criminal operation. "This isn't just elder abuse, it's organized fraud on a massive scale. The FBI has task forces that specialize in exactly this kind of multi-state financial crime." But before we could contact federal authorities, I needed to ensure that Daniel and the twins would be protected from any fallout from Bethany's exposure. My son had been an unwitting accomplice in her schemes, manipulated into supporting actions that were designed to harm me. The children were being raised by someone who might be capable of violence if she felt threatened. I decided that the final confrontation needed to happen in a controlled environment where Bethany's true nature would be revealed to Daniel directly, where he could see for himself what kind of person he'd married and what kind of mother was raising his children. The opportunity came when Bethany suggested that it might be time to make our trial arrangement permanent. She'd prepared legal documents that would give her power of attorney over my financial and medical decisions, and she wanted to schedule a family meeting to discuss the formalization of her role as my caregiver. "Your mother has been doing so much better with proper support," she told Daniel, scheduling the meeting for a Saturday afternoon when the twins would be at a friend's birthday party. "I think we should make these arrangements official so everyone knows what to expect going forward." I agreed to the meeting enthusiastically, expressing gratitude for all of Bethany's help and acknowledging that I probably did need more assistance than I'd been willing to admit. But what I was actually doing was setting the stage for her complete exposure. Carol and Sarah Wellington would be present as witnesses, though Bethany wouldn't know who they were until the meeting was underway. I'd arranged for all of our evidence to be organized and ready for presentation, including the surveillance footage, financial records, and background investigation results. Most importantly, I'd contacted Detective Maria Santos from the Maine State Police, who specialized in elder abuse and financial crimes. Detective Santos would be standing by ready to make arrests based on the evidence we'd gathered and the crimes we expected Bethany to attempt during the meeting. The morning of the meeting, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness that surprised me with its intensity. I was about to destroy my son's marriage and reveal that the mother of his children was a criminal predator. Even though I knew it was necessary, even though I understood that Bethany posed a genuine threat to our family's safety and well-being, I grieved for the pain this revelation would cause Daniel and the twins. But I also felt something else. Pride. The woman who'd been dismissed as attention-seeking and possibly delusional had successfully uncovered and documented a sophisticated criminal operation. The grieving widow who everyone thought was becoming dependent and incompetent had outmaneuvered a predator who'd successfully exploited multiple victims over several years. Daniel arrived first, looking nervous and uncertain about the formal family meeting Bethany had requested. He'd brought flowers, a gesture that reminded me of the thoughtful boy he'd always been, even when dealing with situations that made him uncomfortable. "Mom, are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked, sitting beside me on the couch where we'd had countless conversations over the years. "You don't have to agree to anything you're not comfortable with, no matter what Bethany thinks would be best." His concern touched me deeply because it reminded me that underneath all of Bethany's manipulation, my son still cared about my welfare and autonomy. He'd been misled about my condition and capabilities, but his fundamental love and respect for me hadn't been destroyed. "I'm ready," I told him, which was absolutely true, though not in the way he expected. Bethany arrived precisely on time, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and wearing the kind of professional outfit she typically saved for important business meetings. She'd brought a notary public with her, someone she introduced as a colleague who could witness our signatures on the power of attorney document. What Bethany didn't notice was that Carol and Sarah had already arrived and were waiting in Robert's study, positioned where they could observe everything that happened during the meeting. She also didn't notice the discreet recording equipment that was capturing every word of our conversation. "Margaret, I'm so glad we're finally making these arrangements official," Bethany began, spreading documents across the coffee table with practiced efficiency. "These legal protections will ensure that you receive the care you need, while giving your family peace of mind about your well-being." She launched into a detailed explanation of the power of attorney documents, describing how they would allow her to make financial and medical decisions on my behalf, whenever I was unable to do so myself. The language was carefully crafted to sound protective and temporary, but I recognized the legal implications from my consultations with Sarah Wellington. Once signed, these documents would give Bethany essentially unlimited control over my life and assets. She could place me in a care facility against my will, liquidate my investments, sell my house, and make any medical decisions she deemed appropriate. The temporary nature of the arrangement was illusory. Once someone had legal power of attorney, overturning that authority was extremely difficult and expensive. "I'm not sure I understand all of this," I said, playing my role as the confused elderly woman who needed guidance. "It seems very complicated. Are you sure this is necessary?" Bethany's response was a masterclass in manipulation. She explained that my recent health concerns and episodes of confusion made these arrangements essential for my protection. She cited specific examples of poor judgment I'd supposedly demonstrated. Incidents that were either fabricated or grossly exaggerated versions of normal, everyday decisions. Your mother has been having more difficulty managing her affairs than she's willing to admit, Bethany told Daniel, her tone conveying compassionate concern while systematically undermining my credibility. Last week she forgot to pay her electric bill and seemed confused about why her account was overdue. She's been missing medical appointments and forgetting to take her medications consistently. Every example she provided was either completely false or a distorted version of minor, isolated incidents, but the cumulative effect was to paint a picture of someone experiencing significant cognitive decline who clearly needed immediate intervention and supervision. Daniel looked troubled as he listened to Bethany's litany of concerns, clearly conflicted between his desire to trust his wife's assessment and his own observations of my behavior. "Mom, is this accurate?" he asked gently. "Have you been having trouble keeping track of things?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the opportunity to reveal everything Bethany had been hiding while she was in the act of attempting to defraud me. "Actually, Daniel," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I think there are some things about Bethany that you should know before we sign any legal documents." The change in Bethany's expression was immediate and dramatic. The mask of compassionate concern slipped completely, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd glimpsed only briefly during our previous interaction. "Margaret, I don't think this is the appropriate time for family conflicts," she said, her voice taking on an edge that Daniel had probably never heard before. "We're here to discuss your care needs, not to relitigate old disagreements." But I was already signaling to Carol and Sarah, who emerged from the study carrying boxes of evidence that represented months of careful investigation and documentation. "Daniel, I'd like you to meet Carol Zhang, a private investigator, and Sarah Wellington, an attorney who specializes in elder abuse cases. They've been helping me research some concerning information about your wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel looked confused and betrayed, clearly struggling to understand why I'd involved outside professionals in what he'd thought was a family discussion. Bethany looked trapped and dangerous, her eyes darting between the exits as she calculated her options. "This is ridiculous," Bethany said, standing abruptly and gathering her documents. "Margaret, I don't know what kind of paranoid fantasies you've been entertaining, but I'm not going to sit here and listen to accusations from strangers you've hired to validate your delusion." But Carol was already spreading evidence across the coffee table, documents and photographs that told the story of Bethany's real background and criminal activities. "Mrs. Chen," Carol said, using Bethany's real name with pointed emphasis, "I think you should sit down. We have quite a lot to discuss." The evidence presentation that followed was devastating in its thoroughness. Carol methodically outlined Bethany's pattern of targeting elderly victims, her false identity and fabricated background, her previous marriages to older men who died under suspicious circumstances, and her current financial crimes against multiple families. Sarah explained the legal implications of Bethany's actions, describing how the power of attorney documents she'd prepared would have given her essentially unlimited control over my assets and decisions. She also detailed the evidence we'd gathered of Bethany's attempts to access my accounts and transfer money without authorization. Most damning was the surveillance footage and recorded conversations that showed Bethany's true attitudes toward me and her family. We played the recording where she discussed her timeline for asset transfer and her plans to place me in a low-cost care facility once she'd gained legal control. Daniel's face went through a series of expressions as the evidence mounted: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of cold rage I'd never seen from my gentle son. He was watching his marriage, his family and his understanding of reality crumble as he learned that the woman he'd loved and trusted was a criminal predator who'd targeted his family specifically for financial exploitation. "The children," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are Emma and Ethan safe? Are they really my children?" Carol nodded reassuringly. "DNA testing confirms that the twins are your biological children. There's no evidence that they've been harmed,"
though they've obviously been living with someone who's capable of serious crime. Bethany had remained silent during most of the evidence presentation, but as the reality of her exposure became undeniable, her demeanor shifted completely. The caring, concerned daughter-in-law disappeared entirely, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice carrying a threat that made everyone in the room tense. "Those children are my children too, and if you think you can destroy my life without consequences, you're more naive than I thought." It was exactly the kind of threatening statement that Detective Santos needed to hear. She'd been monitoring our conversation from a van outside the house, and Bethany's implied threat against the children was sufficient grounds for immediate arrest. The door opened and Detective Santos entered with 2 uniformed officers, their presence transforming our family meeting into a crime scene. "Bethany Chen, you're under arrest for elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud." The arrest process was swift and professional, but watching my daughter-in-law being handcuffed in my living room was surreal and heartbreaking, not because I felt sorry for Bethany, but because I could see the devastating impact this revelation was having on Daniel. As the police led Bethany away, she made one final attempt at manipulation, calling out to Daniel with tears in her eyes and protestations of love that might have been convincing if we hadn't just heard recordings of her real feelings about our family. "Daniel, don't let them poison you against me," she pleaded. "I love you and the children more than anything. This is all a misunderstanding that we can work out together." But Daniel didn't respond. He was staring at the evidence spread across the coffee table, trying to process the magnitude of the deception he'd been living with for 3 years. After the police left, the 4 of us sat in my living room, surrounded by the debris of a criminal investigation and a destroyed marriage. Daniel was struggling to understand how he'd been so completely deceived, how the woman he'd planned to spend his life with had been systematically planning to destroy his family. "How long have you known?" he asked me, his voice raw with emotion. I explained about the fainting incident, and Bethany's callous response, about the growing patterns of manipulation I'd begun to notice, about my decision to investigate rather than simply accept her version of events. I told him about hiring Carol and Sarah, about the medical evaluations that proved my competence, about the months of careful documentation and evidence gathering. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner," I said, reaching for his hand. "But she'd been so effective at convincing you that I was becoming unreliable. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away." Daniel nodded, understanding the impossible position Bethany's manipulation had created. "She was so convincing," he said. "Everything she said about your behavior, your health, your need for supervision, it all seemed to make sense. I thought I was being a caring son by supporting her recommendation." Carol explained that this was exactly how sophisticated manipulation worked, particularly when it targeted family relationships. Abusers like Bethany are experts at identifying and exploiting the love and concern that exist within family. They use those positive emotions as weapons to achieve their goals. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Daniel needed to understand the full scope of what had happened, not just to our family but to Bethany's other victims. He needed to know that his children had been living with someone who was capable of murder, that the life he'd built was based entirely on lies and criminal exploitation, but he also needed to understand that none of this was his fault. Bethany was a professional predator who'd spent years perfecting her techniques. The fact that she'd been able to deceive him wasn't a reflection of his judgment or character, it was a testament to her skill at manipulation and fraud. As the afternoon wore on, Detective Santos returned to update us on the investigation and arrest. Bethany was being held without bail while federal authorities determined the full scope of her criminal activity. The evidence we'd gathered had already led to the identification of additional victims, and more charges were likely to be filed. "This case is going to take months to fully investigate," Detective Santos explained, "but I want you to know that your documentation and evidence gathering probably saved multiple families from significant financial and emotional harm." She also provided information about victim services and support resources for Daniel and the children, acknowledging that recovering from this kind of systematic deception would take time and professional help. That evening, after everyone had left, and Daniel had gone to collect the twins from their friend's party, I sat alone in my house and reflected on everything that had happened. The woman who dismissed my fainting spell as attention-seeking behavior was now in jail, facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison. More importantly, my family was sick. Daniel would need time to heal from the betrayal and deception he'd experienced, and the twins would need help understanding why their mother was no longer living with them, but they were all free from Bethany's manipulation and safe from her criminal activity. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Bethany's criminal enterprise. She'd been operating for over a decade, targeting elderly individuals and their families across multiple states. Her victims included not just the elderly people she'd directly exploited, but their children and grandchildren who'd been manipulated into supporting her action. The financial losses she'd caused totaled well over $2 million, but the emotional damage to the families she'd destroyed was incalculable. Many of her victims had died without ever knowing they'd been systematically robbed by someone they'd trusted as a caregiver or family member. Daniel filed for divorce immediately, seeking full custody of the twins and working with authorities to ensure that Bethany had no access to the children while awaiting trial.